"We have to go now!" Elijah shouted, grabbing George's arm as the sound of their pursuers' footsteps echoed through the narrow space, closing in right behind them. The screech of worn-out bus brakes jolted Elijah Johnson from his thoughts. He adjusted his tattered hoodie and leaned against a rusted lamppost at the Greyhound station, his sharp brown eyes scanning the bustling chaos. A wave of cold air swept through the station, carrying with it the distinct mix of exhaust fumes and fried food. This was his world, raw, unforgiving, and teeming with stories no one cared to hear. Elijah, 12 years old, lean and wiry from years of running errands for tips. His skin darker than most in this part of town, a constant reminder of the line drawn between us and them. He stuffed his hands deeper into his pockets, feeling the rough fabric of his worn jeans and the weight of his mother's expectations. She worked double shifts at the diner, her hands cracked and calloused, yet she never missed a chance to remind Elijah of the values she held dear: honesty, integrity, and hope. But hope was in short supply. The bus station was alive with motion. Suitcases rolling, heels clicking, voices raised in hurried conversations. Elijah wasn't here for the noise, he was here for the hustle. A quick delivery, a bag carried for someone too tired to haul their own, anything to bring home a few bucks. His mother's cough had worsened, and the thought of her sitting up late, breathing through her old inhaler, gnawed at his chest. It was just another day, until it wasn't. Elijah had spotted the necklace purely by chance. Its gold chain caught the weak afternoon sun, glinting like a beacon among the dirt-streaked concrete. The pendant was an intricate design, its central gem an emerald so vivid it seemed almost alive. The chain's weight in his hand sent a rush of possibilities racing through his mind. He looked around, scanning the crowd. No one seemed to notice him, or the treasure he'd found. For a moment, his heart pounded with something foreign, something dangerous. Greed. Finders keepers, a voice whispered in his mind. He shook his head. His mother's voice cut through the noise. "Elijah, you're better than that." He tucked the necklace into his pocket and walked away, his steps heavy with indecision. It would fetch enough to buy his mother's medications for months, maybe even cover their overdue rent. But as he approached the corner store to grab a sandwich, his resolve faltered. A small TV mounted near the cash register caught his eye, and his stomach clenched. "A priceless family heirloom," the anchor woman announced. The screen displayed an image of the necklace. George Haynes, a prominent businessman, is offering a significant reward for its safe return. The piece holds deep sentimental value, as it belonged to his late wife. Elijah froze. A reward? He clenched his jaw. The money could change their lives, but would it come at a cost to his conscience? A decision haunted him as he lay on the couch that night, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mother's cough echoed from the next room, a grim reminder of their reality. Elijah fingered the necklace, feeling the smooth surface of the emerald. He wanted to believe he was a good person, but life hadn't rewarded him for playing by the rules. By morning, he'd made up his mind. He'd return it, not for the reward, but because it was the right thing to do. At least, that's what he told himself. The mansion stood in stark contrast to the world Elijah knew. Tall wrought-iron gates guarded sprawling lawns and pristine white columns that seemed to touch the sky. Elijah hesitated at the intercom, his fingers trembling. Don't forget to like if you find this story meaningful to you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. When the gate buzzed open, he stepped onto the stone path, clutching the necklace like a lifeline. The butler led him into an opulent sitting room where George Haynes awaited. The man was in his late 50s, his graying hair slicked back, his tailored suit screaming wealth. Yet his face was drawn, his eyes shadowed by grief. Elijah held out the necklace, his words stumbling. "I think this belongs to you." George's eyes widened. He reached out, his hands trembling as they brushed against the pendant. For a moment, the man seemed to forget Elijah was there. He stared at the necklace as if it were a ghost. This was my wife's," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "Where did you find it?" "At the bus station," Elijah replied, his tone cautious. "Near some old luggage." George's expression darkened. "That area, it's dangerous. You shouldn't be there." "I live nearby," Elijah said simply. George looked up, studying him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then George took a deep breath. "You've done me a great service, young man. I owe you more than words." Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't come for a reward. Just thought you'd want it back." George smiled faintly, but the sorrow in his eyes remained. "That makes what you've done even more remarkable. But I must ask, could you show me where you found it?" The streets were a different world from the manicured gardens Elijah had just left. As he guided George through the alleys and back roads, Elijah felt the weight of the man's presence. George seemed out of place, his polished shoes clicking against uneven pavement, his gaze wary. They stopped near a row of abandoned buildings, the windows boarded up, graffiti scrawled across the walls. Elijah pointed to a spot near the dumpster. "Right there." George knelt, his hands brushing the ground as if searching for clues. Elijah watched him with a mix of curiosity and unease. Then they heard it, a low voice, muffled but distinct. Elijah's heart skipped. He grabbed George's arm. "We need to go. Now!" But George didn't move. His eyes locked onto a group of men lingering near the building's entrance. They were rough, their clothes mismatched, their movements calculated. One of them held a clipboard, pointing to the side of the building as if giving orders. "Traffickers," George whispered, his voice tight. "I've seen their kind before." Elijah's stomach turned. "We shouldn't be here." But George's attention was fixed on something else, a photograph pinned to the wall inside the building, partially visible through a gap in the boards. The image of a young girl with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. "My daughter," George breathed. Elijah's mind raced. "Lucy!" The name had been in the news when the necklace first went missing. George's daughter had been kidnapped months ago, with no ransom demand or clues. "We have to leave," Elijah insisted. "If they see us..." George ignored him, stepping closer to the building. Elijah cursed under his breath and followed. The men noticed them too late. By the time they shouted, Elijah and George were already running, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. They didn't stop until they reached the main road, their breaths ragged. George gripped Elijah's arm, his eyes blazing. "We're not done." Elijah stared at him, disbelief and fear warring in his chest. "You're crazy. You'll get us killed." George's expression softened, but his determination didn't waver. "They have my daughter, and I need your help." Elijah looked away, the weight of George's words pressing down on him. He didn't want to be a hero, he just wanted to survive. But something in George's gaze sparked a fire Elijah couldn't extinguish, a chance to do something that mattered, to be more than a kid hustling at a bus station. "Fine," Elijah muttered, "but we do it my way." Elijah sat at the edge of his mother's worn-out couch, his leg bouncing uncontrollably. The apartment was quiet, except for the muffled hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. His mother had fallen asleep early, exhausted from her double shift at the diner, her shallow breaths punctuated by the occasional cough that made his chest tighten. He couldn't stop replaying the events at the abandoned building. The image of the photograph pinned to the wall burned into his memory, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile frozen in time. Lucy, George's daughter. Elijah didn't know much about rich folks or their problems, but he knew one thing: that girl didn't belong in a place like that. Yet here he was, gripping the edge of the couch, torn between two impossible choices. The local news crackled from the small TV in the corner, filling the silence. Elijah's gaze flicked toward the screen as a polished anchor announced, "No leads yet in the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Lucy Haynes, daughter of George Haynes, CEO of Haynes Industries. Authorities urge anyone with information to come forward." Elijah's stomach churned. He'd been in the thick of it earlier that day, standing mere feet from a den of men who thrived on the misery of others, and now he was sitting here, paralyzed. He dug his fingers into his knees, trying to ground himself. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "When life throws you a choice, Elijah, always pick the one you can live with tomorrow." But how was he supposed to live with either choice? Getting involved meant risking his life, and his mother's too if these traffickers found out. Walking away meant abandoning Lucy to a fate he didn't even want to imagine. His heart pounded as he wrestled with the thought. Then came the knock at the door. It was soft but insistent, echoing unnaturally in the quiet apartment. Elijah froze. No one visited them this late. Slowly he stood, his pulse thundering in his ears. He crossed the room, his bare feet silent against the cold floor, and peered through the peephole. Toward... I should never got twisted. Elijah's gut twisted. The man stood in the dim hallway, his face drawn and pale under the flickering overhead light. His tailored coat was buttoned tight against the cold, but his shoulders sagged as if the weight of the world rested there. "Elijah," George called softly, "I know you're in there." Elijah hesitated, then unlocked the door and opened it just enough to meet George's eyes. "What are you doing here?" George glanced down the hallway before speaking. "I need your help." Elijah's hand tightened on the edge of the door. "I already helped. I gave you the necklace." It was only the beginning. George stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You saw it too. The photograph." Lucy... Elijah didn't respond, but the guilt bubbling in his chest must have been written all over his face. "I can't do this alone," George continued, desperation creeping into his tone. "The police won't act without concrete evidence, and I don't have time to wait for them to jump through bureaucratic hoops. Every second counts." "With me?" Elijah's voice cracked despite himself. "I'm just some kid trying to survive. This isn't my fight." George's gaze hardened, though his voice remained steady. "It became your fight the moment you walked into that building. You know the area, the people. You can help me find her." Elijah shook his head, panic rising. No, you don't get it. These guys, if they see me poking around again, I'm dead. And if they figure out I helped you, my mom's next." George's expression softened, and he stepped closer. "I understand the risk, but imagine if it were your mother in that photograph. Or you. Would you want someone to walk away?" It felt insanely fun to be playing a brave gallerist, packing handcrafted pizzas for a delicious dinner for Elliot, and then finding Elliot's place in the photograph with my actual food, making a presentable appearance for lunch. Hours later, Elijah found himself back in the mansion study, the heavy scent of leather and mahogany filling the air. George had insisted they come here to talk privately, far from prying eyes and ears. Elijah shifted uncomfortably in the plush chair, feeling out of place amidst the room's elegance. His eyes flicked to the walls lined with books, their spines gleaming under the warm light. George sat across from him, his hands clasped tightly as he leaned forward. "I won't lie to you, this is dangerous. But you've already proven you have courage. You saw those men and walked away alive. That tells me you're smart, resourceful." Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face. I'm not some hero, Mr. Haynes. I'm just trying to make it through the day." "And yet, here you are," George replied firmly. "You could have walked away when you found the necklace, but you didn't. That says something." Elijah stared at the man, torn between resentment and reluctant admiration. Finally, he muttered, "What's your plan?" George's shoulders eased slightly, as if he'd been holding his breath. "We need more evidence, something the police or the FBI can't ignore. I've hired a private investigator, but we need someone on the ground, someone who knows how to navigate the area without drawing attention." "And you think that's me?" "I don't think. I know." Elijah let out a humorless laugh. "You've got a lot more faith in me than I do." "I don't have a choice," George admitted, "and neither do you if you think about it. Those men know you were there. They'll come looking eventually, but if we act fast, we can end this before they have the chance." The room fell silent. Elijah's gaze dropped to the floor, his mind racing. The thought of going back into that world filled him with dread, but the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse. He thought of Lucy, the girl in the photograph, the terror she must be feeling, the helplessness. He couldn't turn his back on that. "All right," Elijah said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll help. But if this goes south, it's on you." George nodded, a flicker of relief passing over his face. "We'll be careful, I promise." The next day, Elijah stood in front of a grimy warehouse on the outskirts of town, the air thick with the stench of oil and decay. George had parked a block away, staying out of sight. Elijah's task was simple: get close enough to gather intel, but not close enough to be noticed. He slipped around the side of the building, his heart pounding in his chest. The memories of the previous day came rushing back. The voices, the men, the photograph. Every sound seemed amplified: the crunch of gravel under his sneakers, the distant hum of traffic, the low murmur of voices inside the warehouse. Peering through a cracked window, Elijah's stomach twisted. Inside, a group of men was gathered around a table, sorting through what looked like passports and photographs. A large man with a shaved head barked orders, his voice sharp and commanding. Elijah recognized him from the building the day before. The leader. His hands trembled as he fished a disposable phone from his pocket, snapping a few blurry pictures. He didn't know if they'd be enough, but it was a start. As he turned to leave, a metallic clatter echoed behind him. Elijah froze, his blood running cold. He'd kicked over an old paint can. The voices inside went silent. Elijah ducked behind a stack of pallets, his breath shallow. The warehouse door creaked open and heavy footsteps approached. Sweat trickled down his back as he pressed himself tighter against the pallets, willing himself invisible. A voice called out, sharp and suspicious, "Who's there?" Elijah's mind raced. His only chance was to move fast and pray he wasn't seen. As the footsteps drew closer, he darted out from his hiding spot, sprinting toward the alley. A shout rang out behind him, followed by the sound of pounding footsteps. He ran like his life depended on it, because it did. When Elijah finally burst into George's car, his chest heaving and his legs shaking, George turned to him, alarmed. What happened? "They saw me," Elijah gasped. "We need to go. Now." George didn't hesitate. He slammed the car into gear, the tires screeching as they sped away. As the warehouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, Elijah slumped in the seat, his heart still racing. "Did you get anything?" George asked. Elijah held up the phone, his hand trembling. "Pictures, but I don't know if they're enough." George glanced at him, his expression grim but determined. "It's a start." Elijah nodded, his resolve hardening. He was in this now, whether he liked it or not. And there was no turning back. The headlights of George's car sliced through the darkness as it rolled to a stop in a deserted alley. Elijah, sitting in the passenger seat, gripped the edges of his seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. The images he'd captured at the warehouse felt like a heavy weight in his pocket, a burning reminder of the danger they were stepping into. "We shouldn't be out here again," Elijah muttered, his voice barely audible over the car's rumbling engine. George turned to him, his expression firm. "We have to follow up. Every second we wait, Lucy gets farther away." Elijah exhaled sharply and looked out the window. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that promised trouble lurking just beyond the shadows. Earlier that evening, George had pored over the grainy photos Elijah had managed to take. The images showed not only the traffickers' faces, but also a map on the table, partially obscured, but with enough details to hint at a new location. Elijah had recognized one of the streets, an industrial zone near the harbor, notorious for its labyrinth of warehouses and sparse police presence. "We need to go there," George had said with urgency, his finger tracing the outline of the map. Elijah's immediate response had been a firm, "No way." But here they were, creeping through the harbor district under the cover of night. George parked the car in a secluded corner and they stepped out into the cold night air. The wind carried the tang of salt water and the faint hum of machinery from the docks. Elijah pulled his hood tighter over his head, his breath visible in the chilly air. "This is insane," he whispered as they approached the first warehouse. The building loomed above them, its rusted metal walls streaked with grime. A single flickering light above the entrance cast long, sinister shadows. George didn't reply, his focus locked on the task ahead. He gestured for Elijah to follow as they moved closer, crouching low to stay out of sight. Elijah's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out every other sound. At the side of the warehouse, George stopped and peeked through a cracked window. Elijah joined him, their heads close together as they scanned the interior. The scene inside was a hive of activity. Men moved in and out, carrying boxes marked with foreign symbols. Elijah spotted a table covered with fake IDs, cash, and what looked like shipping manifests. His stomach churned when he noticed a row of chairs against the far wall, each with a pair of handcuffs dangling from the armrests. "This is it," George whispered, his voice tight. "This is where they're operating." Elijah's throat tightened. He wanted to turn and run, to disappear back into the safety of his small, predictable life. But then he thought of Lucy, and the thought of her being trapped here forced his feet to stay rooted. "We should call the cops," he said, his voice trembling. "They won't move without solid proof," George replied, his jaw clenched. "We need something more concrete." Elijah swallowed hard. How much more concrete do they need? George didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward a side door, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. "We need to get closer." "You're crazy," Elijah hissed. "You'll get us both killed." George's expression softened, and for the first time, Elijah saw the fear in his eyes. "I don't have a choice, Elijah. She's my daughter." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. He nodded reluctantly and followed George as they crept toward the side door. The air inside the warehouse was thick and suffocating, heavy with the scent of oil and damp wood. Elijah's sneakers squeaked softly against the floor, and he winced at the sound. They moved cautiously, staying close to the shadows. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot in the silence. George gestured toward a staircase leading to a loft overlooking the main floor. Elijah hesitated but followed, his pulse racing. From the loft, they had a clear view of the operation below. Elijah spotted a clipboard on the table below, its pages filled with lists and schedules. He nudged George and whispered, "That's what we need." George nodded, but before they could move, the sound of approaching footsteps froze them in place. 2 men entered the loft, their voices low but distinct. "I don't trust the new kid," one of them said, his tone sharp. "He's been asking too many questions." "He'll learn to keep his mouth shut," the other replied, "or he'll disappear like the rest." Elijah's breath caught. He pressed himself against the wall, praying the shadows would keep them hidden. George didn't move, his eyes locked on the men. The first man stopped, his gaze sweeping the loft. Something doesn't feel right. Elijah's chest tightened as the man stepped closer, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. George placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, signaling him to stay still. The man's gaze lingered on the corner where they were hiding, and for a moment, Elijah thought they were done for, but then a shout from below drew the man's attention. "Hey, we need you down here." With a grunt, the man turned and headed downstairs, his companion following close behind. Elijah let out a shaky breath, his entire body trembling. That was too close. George nodded, his expression grim. "We need to move, now." They descended the stairs quietly, keeping to the shadows. George grabbed the clipboard from the table, his hands quick but steady. Elijah kept watch, his eyes darting nervously around the room. As they turned to leave, a low voice stopped them in their tracks. "What the hell are you doing here?" Elijah spun around to see one of the men from earlier, his face twisted with suspicion. The man's hand hovered near his waistband, where a gun was holstered. "Rotten," George whispered. Before Elijah could process the word, George shoved him toward the door. Elijah stumbled but regained his footing, sprinting toward the exit. Behind him, the sound of shouting erupted, followed by heavy footsteps. George was right behind him, the clipboard clutched tightly in his hand. They burst through the side door and into the cold night air, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "This way," Elijah yelled, leading George down a narrow alley. The men were close behind, their voices growing louder. Elijah's mind raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He spotted a stack of crates and grabbed one, shoving it into the path of their pursuers. The crash bought them a few precious seconds, but it wouldn't be enough. They rounded a corner and darted into another alley, this one lined with dumpsters. George grabbed Elijah's arm and pulled him behind a dumpster, both of them crouching low as their pursuers ran past. Elijah pressed a hand to his chest, trying to calm his racing heart. "This is insane." George didn't respond. He peeked around the edge of the dumpster, his eyes scanning the alley. When the coast was clear, he turned to Elijah. "We need to get out of here." Elijah nodded, his legs shaking as they stood. Together, they made their way back to the car, every shadow feeling like a potential threat. Back at the mansion, the gravity of what they'd just done hit them both. George spread the contents of the clipboard across the desk, his hands shaking. The pages were filled with names, addresses, and shipping schedules, evidence that connected the traffickers to a larger network. "This is it," George said, his voice trembling with a mix of relief and determination. "This is what we needed." Elijah sank into a chair, his body aching from the tension of the night. "It's not over, is it?" George shook his head. "No, but this is a start." For the first time, Elijah allowed himself to hope that they might actually have a chance to make things right, but deep down he knew the worst was yet to come. The dim light of the study cast long shadows across the walls as George paced back and forth, the weight of their discovery hanging heavy in the air. Elijah sat slumped in a chair, staring at the pages spread out on the desk. The list of names and shipping schedules revealed something far darker and more extensive than either of them had anticipated. "This is a damn operation," George muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's not just Lucy. There are other girls, other families. God, Elijah, this is bigger than I thought." Elijah's stomach churned. He didn't want to think about the other names on that list, each one representing someone trapped in a nightmare. He shifted uncomfortably, his legs bouncing with nervous energy. "So, what do we do now? We can't just sit on this." George nodded, his jaw tight. "We bring this to the FBI. They'll have the resources to take these bastards down." Elijah frowned. "And what if they don't act fast enough? We're talking about a network, not just a couple of guys in a warehouse. If they catch wind that someone's onto them, they'll disappear. Lucy and the others will be gone." George stopped pacing and looked at Elijah, his expression conflicted. He knew the boy was right, but the thought of taking matters into their own hands made his stomach turn. "Then we gather more evidence. Something undeniable." Elijah sat up straighter, a spark of determination in his eyes. I know where to start." The industrial district was a maze of dimly lit streets and towering warehouses, each one a potential hub for illegal activity. Elijah led George to a decrepit building on the edge of the district, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows shattered. "This place used to be a loading dock," Elijah explained, keeping his voice low. "I've seen guys coming in and out of here at night. I think it's a drop point." George looked skeptical but didn't argue. "If we're going in, we need to be careful." Elijah smirked, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "Careful isn't exactly my specialty." They slipped into the building through a side door, the hinges creaking softly as it swung open. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of oil and mildew. George pulled out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Elijah motioned for him to keep it low. "We can't risk being seen." They moved through the space cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. Elijah's nerves were on edge, every creak of the floorboards making his heart race. Then they heard it, a low murmur of voices coming from deeper inside the building. George and Elijah exchanged a tense glance before creeping closer. The voices grew louder, more distinct, until they could make out the conversation. "They're moving the shipment tomorrow," one man said, his tone sharp and businesslike. "Everything needs to be ready by dawn." "Relax," another replied. "We've done this 100 times. Nothing's gonna go wrong." Elijah felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. They were hearing the traffickers' plans in real time. He reached for his phone, holding it steady as he recorded the conversation. George remained still, his jaw clenched as he listened. But then, Elijah's hand slipped, his phone hitting the ground with a muffled thud. The sound was small, but in the quiet space, it might as well have been a gunshot. "What was that?" one of the men said, his voice sharp. Elijah's eyes widened, panic surging through him. George grabbed his arm and whispered, "Run!" They bolted, their footsteps echoing through the building as shouts erupted behind them. The men gave chase, their heavy boots pounding against the floor. Elijah's lungs burned as he sprinted toward the exit, George right behind him. "This way!" Elijah shouted, veering toward a narrow hallway. They burst through another door, the cold night air hitting them like a slap to the face. But there was no time to catch their breath. The men were still on their heels, and they weren't going to stop until they caught them. Elijah led George through a series of alleys, twisting and turning in an attempt to lose their pursuers. The sound of their shouts grew fainter, but Elijah knew better than to slow down. Finally, they ducked behind a dumpster, both of them gasping for air. George leaned against the wall, clutching his side. You okay?" Elijah nodded, though his chest felt like it was about to explode. "Yeah, barely." They waited in silence, straining to hear any signs of the men. When it became clear that the coast was clear, George turned to Elijah. "You got it, didn't you? The recording?" Elijah pulled out his phone, his hands trembling. "Yeah, it's not much, but it's something." George nodded, relief washing over him. "Let's get out of here." Back at the mansion, George played the recording on his laptop, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The voices were clear enough to make out the details, and the mention of a shipment at dawn was impossible to ignore. "This is our chance," George said, his voice filled with urgency. "If we can follow them to the shipment, we'll have all the proof we need." Elijah stared at the screen, his mind racing. "And what happens if they catch us this time? You saw how close they got." George's expression hardened. "We'll be prepared." The following morning, Elijah and George staked out the building from a safe distance, watching as the traffickers loaded crates into a truck. The air was tense, every movement feeling like a potential spark to ignite the situation. "There!" George whispered, pointing to the license plate. "We need to follow them." Elijah nodded, his palms sweating as he gripped the edge of the car seat. They waited until the truck pulled out before starting the engine, keeping a safe distance as they followed it through the industrial district and onto the highway. The drive was nerve-wracking, the tension in the car palpable. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, every car on the road a potential threat. George kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tight. After what felt like an eternity, the truck pulled into another warehouse, this one surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. George parked a safe distance away and they watched as the men unloaded the crates. This is it," George said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We call the FBI." Elijah nodded, pulling out his phone, but before he could dial, something caught his eye. A flash of blonde hair in the back of the truck. His heart stopped. "Lucy," he breathed. George's head snapped toward the truck, his face pale. Without thinking, he opened the car door. "Wait," Elijah hissed, grabbing his arm. "You can't just run in there." George shook him off, his eyes blazing. "That's my daughter." Elijah cursed under his breath and followed, his mind racing. They crept toward the fence, their movements careful and deliberate. George's focus was unshakable, his determination overriding any fear. When they reached the fence, George peered through the gaps, his breath hitching when he saw her. Lucy was sitting in the back of the truck, her hands bound and her face pale. Elijah felt a surge of anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "We need to get her out," George said, his voice shaking. Elijah nodded, "But we have to be smart about it. If they see us—" Before he could finish, one of the men shouted and chaos erupted. George and Elijah ducked as a group of armed men emerged from the warehouse, their weapons aimed at the truck. "What the hell is going on?" one of them barked. Elijah's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. Then he saw it. A stack of pallets near the fence, precariously balanced. He nudged George and pointed. "We can use that." George nodded and they moved quickly, using the pallets as cover as they made their way closer to the truck. Elijah's heart pounded as they approached, every step feeling like a gamble. When they reached the truck, George climbed in, his hands shaking as he untied Lucy. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and relief. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. Fine?" George pulled her into a hug, his body shaking. "I've got you, sweetheart. I've got you." Elijah kept watch, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of the men. "We need to move. Now." George helped Lucy out of the truck, and they made their way back to the car, every step feeling like a marathon. The shouts of the traffickers grew louder as they realized what was happening, but Elijah didn't look back. When they finally reached the car, Elijah jumped into the driver's seat, his hands fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life and they sped away, leaving the warehouse behind. As they drove, Lucy clung to George, her body trembling. Elijah glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his chest tightening at the sight. For the first time, he felt like they had a chance, a real chance, to take these monsters down. But he also knew this was far from over. The SUV skidded into the safe house parking lot, gravel spitting under its tires as Elijah threw the car into park. The night had stretched into the early hours of morning, but there was no time to rest. The FBI agents were already waiting, their dark suits blending into the shadows. "Is she okay?" one of the agents asked as George carried Lucy out of the car. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, but her arms wrapped tightly around her father's neck. "She needs medical attention," George snapped. "Where's the nearest doctor?" "We've got paramedics on standby," the agent said. He nodded toward a side door. "Take her inside. We'll handle everything." As George rushed Lucy into the building, Elijah leaned against the car, his legs finally giving out. His lungs burned, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind was spinning. The image of Lucy in that truck, bound and terrified, wouldn't leave him. "You did good, kid," the agent said, his voice cutting through the haze. "But we're not done yet." Elijah looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" The agent exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. "That warehouse isn't the main hub. It's just a piece of the operation. If we don't move fast, they'll scatter." Elijah's stomach dropped. And Lucy? What about the other girls?" "That's why we need you and George," the agent said. "You've seen more than we have. You've been inside. We need every detail." Inside the safe house, George sat beside Lucy as a paramedic checked her vitals. Her voice was weak, but she managed to speak. "Dad, they were going to move us. Somewhere far. I heard them talking." George's grip tightened on her hand. "Do you know where?" Lucy shook her head, her blonde hair falling into her face. "No, but they mentioned something about the docks." "A ship?" George turned to the agent, his expression hard as steel. "You heard her. They're planning to move the girls out of the country. We have to act now." The agent nodded. "We've got a team assembling, but we'll need your help, both of you." Elijah, standing in the doorway, blinked in surprise. "Me? What can I do?" The man said he had no doctor, but he had spoken to his father before about exercise, and it can help. "You know the area better than anyone," the agent said, "and George here isn't exactly going to sit this one out." George stood, his jaw set. "Damn right I'm not." The makeshift command center buzzed with activity as agents pored over maps and dossiers. Elijah sat at the edge of the room, his leg bouncing nervously. The enormity of the situation was hitting him in waves. He wasn't a hero, he was just a kid who'd stumbled into something far bigger than himself. George approached, a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You okay?" Elijah shrugged. "I'm not exactly built for this, man." George crouched beside him, his voice low. "Neither am I, but this isn't about what we're built for. It's about what we're willing to fight for." Elijah met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not just a grieving father, but a man determined to make things right, no matter the cost. "All right," Elijah said, his voice firm. "Let's do this." The plan was simple in theory, but deadly in execution. The FBI would raid the docks, using the intel from Lucy and Elijah to pinpoint the traffickers' hideouts. George and Elijah would guide the team, staying close but out of immediate danger. As they drove toward the harbor, the air in the van was thick with tension. Elijah gripped the edge of his seat, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. George sat beside him, silent but resolute. When they arrived, the agents fanned out, their weapons drawn. Elijah and George stayed behind the main line, watching as the team moved with practiced precision. The first warehouse was empty, the scent of the diesel and salt water hanging in the air. But the second was alive with noise, a low murmur of voices, the clatter of crates, and then a scream. "Move in!" the lead agent barked, and the team surged forward. The interior of the warehouse was chaos. Men shouted as they scrambled to escape, but the agents were quick, blocking exits and shouting commands. Elijah stayed near the door, his heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. George, however, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. And then he saw her. The man from the loft. The one who had been giving orders. George's face twisted with fury. "You," he growled, stepping toward him. The man sneered, pulling a gun from his waistband. "Stay back, old man." But George didn't stop. He grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung, knocking the gun from the man's hand. The sound echoed through the warehouse, drawing everyone's attention. Elijah's stomach turned as the man lunged at George, but the agents were faster. Two tackled him to the ground, cuffing him before he could land a blow. "Good work," the lead agent said, nodding at George. "We've got him." But George wasn't satisfied. "Where are the other girls?" The man smirked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You're too late." George's fist clenched, but before he could respond, another scream cut through the air. This one was faint, distant. Elijah's eyes widened. "There's another room," he said, pointing toward a door at the back of the warehouse. "That's where they are." The agents moved quickly, breaking down the door and flooding into the hidden space. Inside, they found rows of makeshift cages, each one holding a girl. The sight was horrifying. Some were crying, others silent with fear. Elijah's chest tightened as he took it all in. This was what they were fighting against. This was why they couldn't stop. George rushed forward, his voice breaking as he called out for Lucy. She wasn't there, but the other girls clung to him, their gratitude palpable. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." Elijah stayed back, his hands shaking. He felt out of place, overwhelmed by the weight of what they'd uncovered. But then one of the girls looked at him, her eyes wide with something he hadn't expected. "Let me know what your favorite part of this story was and why. Well, I'd love to hear what you think." The aftermath was a blur of activity. The girls were taken to safety, the traffickers arrested and loaded into unmarked vans. George and Elijah stood outside, watching as the agents packed up. "You did good, kid," George said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Elijah shook his head. "I didn't do anything. You're the one who—" "You stepped up when no one else would," George interrupted. "Don't sell yourself short." Elijah didn't respond, but a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The days that followed were a whirlwind of interviews, paperwork, and media attention. The story of the raid made headlines, but Elijah and George kept their involvement quiet. It wasn't about recognition. It was about justice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, George handed Elijah a small box. Confused, Elijah opened it to find a gold medallion, its surface engraved with 3 words: courage, loyalty, resilience. "You earned this," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't ever forget it." Elijah looked at the medallion, his chest swelling with pride. For the first time in his life, he felt like he mattered, like he'd made a difference. And in that moment, he knew he'd never stop fighting for what was right. The quiet hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights filled the air as George sat beside Lucy's bed, holding her hand tightly. Her face was no longer pale, but regaining some of its natural color. The doctors had assured him she would recover, though the emotional scars might take longer to heal. Lucy stirred, her blue eyes fluttering open. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. George leaned closer, relief washing over him like a wave. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe now." Tears rolled in her eyes. Oh, I thought I'd never see you again. George swallowed hard, his voice breaking. I thought the same, but I wasn't going to stop until I found you. You're my world, Lucy. She squeezed his hand, her fingers trembling. And Elijah, is he okay? George smiled faintly. He's fine. A little shaken, but fine. He's been incredible, Lucy. He wouldn't stop until we got to you. Elijah stood outside the hospital room, leaning against the wall. His body ached from exhaustion, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He'd been part of something he'd never imagined, something that mattered. Yet, the weight of everything he'd seen lingered, heavy and suffocating. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see an FBI agent approaching, a folder tucked under his arm. Elijah, the agent said, his tone formal but kind. We wanted to thank you. Without your help, none of this would have been possible. Elijah shifted uncomfortably. I just did what I had to. The agent nodded, his gaze steady. You did more than that. You saved lives, and we're not done yet. The intel you provided is helping us dismantle the entire network. These guys won't hurt anyone else. Elijah nodded, the words sinking in. Good. They deserve it. The agent handed him a card. If you ever need anything, call me. You've got people in your corner now. Elijah stared at the card, the agent's words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. A week later, George invited Elijah and his mother to their home, a gesture that felt surreal to Elijah. He hesitated at the front door, his mother by his side. She looked nervous, smoothing her worn dress with trembling hands. Elijah, she whispered, her voice soft, are you sure about this? We don't belong here. Elijah turned to her, his expression firm. Yeah, we do. They invited us. They want us here. Before she could respond, the door opened, and George stood there, smiling warmly. Come in, both of you. The house was elegant but welcoming, the kind of place Elijah had only seen on TV. Lucy greeted them in the living room, her face lighting up when she saw Elijah. You came, she said, standing to hug him. I was worried you wouldn't. No, I didn't. Elijah awkwardly returned the hug, his cheeks flushing. Of course I came. I had to see how you were doing. Lucy pulled back, her smile unwavering. Better, thanks to you. Elijah's mother looked around, her eyes wide with wonder. George approached her, his demeanor gentle. You must be Elijah's mother. I've heard so much about you. She smiled nervously. I can't imagine what he said. All good things, George assured her. Your son is remarkable. You've raised someone truly special. Her eyes filled with tears and she quickly wiped them away. Thank you. That means more than you know. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned lighter, filled with laughter and shared stories. George and Lucy made sure Elijah and his mother felt at home, treating them like family. It was a feeling Elijah hadn't experienced in years, if ever. At one point, George leaned closer to Elijah, his voice low. I meant what I said before. If you need anything at all, I'm here. Elijah hesitated, his walls still up, but then he nodded. Thanks, I appreciate it. George smiled, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. You've got a future ahead of you, Elijah. Don't ever doubt that. The next morning, Elijah stood in front of the house, staring at the medallion George had given him. He turned it over in his hands, the words engraved on it catching the morning light. Courage, loyalty, resilience. He thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the danger, the choices he'd made. He wasn't the same kid who'd found that necklace at the bus station. He'd changed, grown. He'd discovered a strength he hadn't known he had. Elijah, his mother called from the car, we need to go. He nodded and slipped the medallion into his pocket. As he walked toward the car, he glanced back at the house. George and Lucy stood on the porch, waving. Elijah waved back, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't face it alone. And no matter what came next, he'd carry the lessons of this journey with him, a reminder of what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. The bus station felt different now. Elijah stood by the same rusted lamppost where his journey had begun, the hum of early morning traffic filling the air. The place was as chaotic as ever, suitcases rolling, voices overlapping. But for the first time, Elijah felt like he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had changed, even if the world around him hadn't. In his pocket, the medallion George had given him felt warm against his hand. He traced the engraving with his thumb. Those 3 words, courage, loyalty, resilience, echoing in his mind. They weren't just words anymore. They were a part of him, etched into his soul as deeply as they were into the metal. "Elijah!" His mother's voice called from behind. He turned to see her standing by the diner where she worked, her apron tied neatly around her waist. She looked more at ease than she had in months, a faint smile softening her usual worried expression. "You ready for the big day?" she asked, walking toward him. Elijah nodded, a rare grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, I'm ready." The big day wasn't anything extravagant. It was his first day at the local community college, something he'd never thought possible. George had made it happen, offering to cover the tuition and even arranging for a part-time job at one of his company's branches. "You've earned this, Elijah," George had told him. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His mother's eyes sparkled with pride as she adjusted the strap on his backpack. "You're gonna do great, you know that? You're smart and you've got a good heart. That's what matters." Elijah shrugged, trying to hide his embarrassment. "I'm just trying to keep up with everything." "You're not just keeping up," she said firmly. "You're leading." That evening, Elijah walked into the small apartment they still called home. It wasn't much, but it was warm, safe, a haven they hadn't always had. On the kitchen table, a single envelope sat waiting for him. The handwriting was neat and familiar. He opened it carefully, unfolding the letter. Inside was a note from Lucy. "Elijah, I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for what you did. You saved me, and not just me, all of us. You showed me what bravery looks like, what hope feels like." "You're my hero, don't forget that." Lucy. A lump rose in Elijah's throat as he reread the words. He set the letter down and sat at the table, his head resting in his hands. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel everything, to cry, to breathe, to heal. The past few weeks had been a storm, but now in the quiet of his apartment, Elijah felt something new, peace. And in that peace, a spark of something even stronger, hope for the future, and a belief that he could face whatever came next,